Hello, thanks for joining us today here at Kindred Church. I'm so glad that we get to spend this time together. Our survey of the Bible brings us to now what is the historical books of the Old Testament. Now, I was going to try and tackle all of these in one discussion, but to do them justice, we're going to try and handle it in two parts. But before we dig in, let's just review a little bit. So far in this journey, we have seen the ultimate purpose of the Bible is that you and I might be brought to a place of maturity in Jesus Christ. However, maturity is simply being a reflection of Jesus in our lives. This is what Paul had prayed for in Ephesians, that our bodies would be filled with God, so that, as he explains to the Philippians, that we can live clean, innocent lives as children of God, shining like bright lights in a world full of crooked and perverse people. This is the purpose of God's revelation, is to mature us. And because God is maturing us, we can walk down the path of truth. We have also seen that the Old Testament's contribution to our maturing process is that of preparation, while the New Testament's contribution is that of realization. In our last study, we examined the first 5 books of Moses, which is referred to as either the Torah in Hebrew or Pentateuch in Latin. In that, we discovered that there is a pattern on display of how God works in people's lives. Genesis tells us the story of humanity's needs, that humanity as a whole has all these needs in our lives. It tells us that we are helpless and weak and overwhelming in our need for God. Then we get to Exodus. Exodus is a book about redemption, but the key to understanding this book is that of ownership. In Exodus, in the covenant that we find there, we become God's people. We're no longer people who are owned by the world. We're people who are owned by God. And in that covenant, God promises to bless us richly. But there are rules. There is an agreement between us and God and for the people of the covenant. Then we get to the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is a book about how we can access God through worship. This book is one of instruction, and through it, it might seem like dry reading, but it teaches us a lot about worship. And then in Numbers is a book about how we as a covenant people who have all these instructions on how we're supposed to worship God fail. Numbers is a book of weakness and failure, and in it's is the story of God's people, because of their failure, wandering in the wilderness. The people were attempting to worship a God, but they had only tried to worship God via their own abilities, through the efforts of the human heart. But the end result is just them wandering around in failure, which brings us to this realization that there is in Deuteronomy, that we finally realize that our human nature is going to fail, so we have to rely on God. Deuteronomy prepares us to enter the promised land, a land that is flowing with milk and honey. And that brings us to the historical books. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Today we will begin to see how these books contribute to the preparatory work of the Old Testament in maturing us as a people. So if the Pentateuch is the section which gives us the pattern of God's working, the historical books then describe the dangers that confront us when we try to live a life of faith. And if you stop and think about it for a minute, this is really what history is for. History is our story. James Russell Lowell once wrote, "Truth forever on a scaffold, wrong forever on a throne. But God is standing in the shadows, keeping watch above their own." That is the relationship of God in history. Yahweh is working behind the scenes. And in the historical books of the Bible, we see a nation of Israel trying to find its place in a chaotic world. But this nation, unlike all the others, had a very special ministry. They were called to be the representatives of God to other nations. From the very beginning, that was their entire purpose. They were to be God's representatives in the world. And what happens to them is a picture of all the dangers that will forever oppress nations anywhere. But more than that, their story illustrates the challenges that Christ followers face as they strive to live a life of faith. This is where these historical books become of such incredible value to us. They show us the dangers of living by faith and how to overcome them. So let's dig in. The first of these historical books is Joshua. Joshua expresses the danger of being content. The danger of being content. It begins, though, with a story of victory. We see the Israelites' entrance into the Promised Land. This was the place where God intended for them to be all along. After leaving Egypt and having a brief time in the desert, this is where they should have been 39 years ago. If only they had believed and trusted in God and God's ability to deliver them, this is where they should have been all along. And this is often what happens in our Christian lives as well. Our life is not only a question of being brought out of something, but also entering into. The problem is that many of us are quite content to be brought out of our Egypt, being brought out of the world and all the ways of the world, but we never quite get around to entering the Promised Land. We have faith enough to be brought out of Egypt, but somewhere we fail to grasp the faith that it takes to go over the Jordan and into this land of promise. But in the book of Joshua, Israel is finally at that place. They are finally at a place where they can enter the Promised Land. And the first obstacle Israel faced was, as they go across this river, was the city of Jericho. In these ancient times, Jericho was well known for having tremendous walls. Those walls, we're told, were 100 feet high and 30 feet thick. That's pretty intimidating, even by today's standards, which meant that in its day, this city would have been kind of like a super fortress. This might have been the first city that many of these people had ever encountered. Remember, they had been in the desert wandering around for 40 years. Now, sure, they probably came across their occasional town and maybe even a few larger towns, but as far as a fortress city, this was probably the first one a lot of them have ever really encountered. So as they looked up at these massive city walls, I am sure they were reminded of their own feebleness. And then they looked down at their weapons, pretty meager weapons at that, and they said to themselves, how can we ever take a walled city like this? You ever felt like that in your life? Has there ever been anything in your life that seemed to be an insurmountable obstacle? Something that you had struggled with, something that might have been mocking you, baffled you, something that has defeated you for years, something you may have seen looming there in its invincibility, and nothing you are able to do seems to have any effect on it. Well, that's your Jericho, okay? But what did God do? It is one of the most amazing stories in the Old Testament. Now, I am not a military person, but I am sure that no military leader in their right mind would ever devise a plan like the strategy they had. The people of God were told to march silently around the walled city once a day for 6 days. Real intimidating. Can you imagine what was going on in the minds of the people of Jericho when they saw this huge mass of potentially hundreds of thousands of people walking around their city? Then on the seventh day, they were told to walk around the city 7 times while there's these trumpets or shofars, which are made out of horns, blowing. Then after the 7th time around, all the people were to shout out as loud as they could because the Lord had given them the city. Now this was, in human terms, an absurd plan, but it was what they were told to do, and they did it. They had the faith to believe in this absurd plan, and they did it. And what happened to those intimidating walls? We're told they collapse. And when a follower of Christ starts to understand and embrace the truth of Jesus living within them, which is what entering into the land signifies, many obstacles that were once a problem, all those things that seemed like they were insurmountable, that there's no way I can defeat this, once we place our trust in Jesus, many of those obstacles suddenly disappear. They just simply aren't there anymore. Their walls have collapsed, and there is an immediate victory. So Jericho is a picture of God's victory in our lives if only we would trust and believe in God and their plan for our lives. The Jericho story is followed by a very different kind of story. Followed by Jericho is a story of Ai. Ai, which is spelled A-I, is in the grand scope of things, a very insignificant town. Nobody thought anything about this little town. It was just a little village described as being a wide spot in the road. So Joshua reasoned, which is the first problem. Joshua reasoned, why waste an entire army on such a little place like that? So he just dispatched a few men, but then they came back defeated. So Joshua went before the Lord and found what the problem was. There was sin in the camp, but when that sin was taken care of, there was victory again. So where Jericho represents God, the victory in God, Ai is a picture of defeat because of sin and a lack of faith. And in our own lives, we think we can control our tempers, right? We all have situations like this. In our own lives, we think we can control our tempers, we can control our lusts, we can control our evil thoughts if we just set our minds to it. If I just am intentionally not going to get angry anymore. We say to ourselves, I'm not going to let this bother me. If we stick to that, we'll be okay. But we quickly discover that's not so easy, is it? However, once we surrender ourselves and our sins over to God, God will bring about victory in every aspect of our lives. Ai is then followed by the Battle of Gibeon, which is, it's a story of deceit. Joshua and all the Israelites were tricked by a few Gibeonites. Some of their people disguised themselves in old, ragged clothes. They carried moldy bread, and they pretended to have come from a far-off place. Then they convinced Joshua to make a pact of protection. However, the Israelites soon discovered that the Gibeonites were not from some distant land that was poor and destroyed. Their city was just right over the next hill. And this story represents the tricks and the deceitfulness of our enemy, especially our enemy in Satan. Our enemy is skilled at deception. And because of this, we often make allowances in our lives and fail to first consult God. Had Joshua simply gone to God with this Gibeonite issue, they would have saved themselves centuries of heartache. Now, the rest of the story of Joshua, we see the Israelites have both failure and victory. So if you look through this story, if you read the book of Joshua, and you can't find some commonalities, some common perils that you have in your own life, then you're just not being honest enough with yourself, because there is every kind of shortcoming that's in here. They're all there. But the core of the book is set forth for us in Joshua 13. Each one of these historical books, as we go through them, there'll be a particular peril of its own. There'll be a special peril of its own, which is designed to describe. But not only does it present this peril, it also shows at least one individual who overcomes that danger. And in the book of Joshua, it is the man Joshua himself. And here's the peril. Okay, here it is. God said to Joshua, "You are old and advanced in years, and there remains very much land to be possessed." This was the problem that Joshua faced. The book depicts a believer who understands the indwelling presence of God in their life. And once a person understands this concept, any believer can immediately experience victory over Satan. It is a glorious and marvelous experience. And it would have been easy for Joshua to say, "Yes, Lord, I am old. Can't I just enjoy the years that I have left?" But this is not what Joshua did. However, at some point, there will be an incomplete victory offered to us. Maybe it'll be like that of Joshua, an opportunity just to settle down and start enjoying life, to take some time off, and let's just not worry about this whole church thing anymore. Let's just kind of stick to ourselves. We'll still believe in God, but we'll just kind of do it in our own private lives. But there's still something that's ultimately incomplete in doing that. So we might think, why should I go any further? Although there are still areas of my life that aren't quite conquered yet, I have already conquered so much, Lord. Just let me enjoy this for a while. Well, there's a very real danger in being content. I think that's one of the most dangerous aspects that we encounter as people of faith. In settling for incompleteness in our conquests, and stopping the progress in our journey. Maybe you've experienced this. It's often the first attack that our enemy gives us. When we find these times where we find victory in conquest, it's like, I look back on my life and I'm so much different of a person. I used to be filled with anger and hatred and bitterness, and I just am not that person anymore. And we get content in that, but there's still so much other things out there that we can do. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." This hunger and thirst must mark our lives, though. At the close of Joshua, you find him saying to the people of Israel, "There is much land yet to be possessed." And then he urges them to continue on doing it. He warns them about some of the attitudes that they were already displaying. And then he says to them in this, Joshua 24:15, "Choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." There was never a letdown in Joshua's life. There was never complacency or comfort in his life. Never a willingness to stop this march. He was on a mission until the day of his death. He never quit. This passage is key to understanding the entire book. His faith is the light that breaks through all the darkness that was really shown in Joshua. So where Joshua expresses the danger of becoming content, the books of Judges and Ruth express the danger of delusion. We will look at these books together with, because the events of Ruth happened during the first half of Judges. So where the book of Joshua covers a period of about 25 years, Judges covers a period of about 300 years. The book records Israel's repeated cycle of defeat. Here's how that cycle went. If you read through Judges over the next week or so, there's this cycle time and time again. Here it is. There's decline, discipline, and deliverance. There's decline of the people's trust and their dependency on God. There's discipline because of their decline, because of their unfaithfulness. And then there is God's deliverance of the people through a judge. Over and over again, God sent judges to help the people of Israel, judges who would free them from persecution and bondage while also ending years of suffering. Now, the book of Judges begins with the story of Othniel, which is the first judge that God sent. And it ends with the very familiar story of Samson, which was the last judge in the book of Judges. They were 7 judges whom served God and delivered people. But time and time again, as soon as God helped the people get back on their feet, they would start to fail once again. Now, why did they fail? What is the peril? What is the danger that we find in Judges? Well, it's stated pretty early on in this book. Judges 2, verse 11. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight and served images of Baal. They abandoned the Lord and the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, worshiping the gods of the people around them, and they had angered the Lord. They abandoned the Lord to serve Baal and the images of Asherah. So we're talking about idolatry. Why? Why did they ever get into this mess? And how did they get into this mess so quickly after all the tremendous victories that they had seen? There's incredible things that these people had seen in Joshua. Remember, this is 25 or so years, maybe 40 years by this point, after all the stuff that had happened in Joshua. So how did they get into this mess of idolatry so quickly? How do people suddenly fall from the height of these victorious experiences into moral degradation? You find the key to this book in the very last verse of the whole thing. It is the key to the kind of experiences that we have in our own lives. Judges 21:25. In those days, Israel had no king, and all the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. The story of Judges is a story about the danger of delusion. It wasn't that these people didn't want to do what was right. It was simply that they were deluded. The text says that they did what was right. Okay? It doesn't say they did what was wrong. It says they did what was right. But they did what was right in their own eyes. And they did what was right in their own eyes because they didn't know what was actually right in God's eyes. This is the terrible danger of what I like to refer to as being dedicated to ignorance. There's nothing wrong with dedication. Dedication is a great thing. These people meant well. They truly did. They meant well. And I have sat with people over the years who tell me terrible stories of agony and anguish and despair. And almost all of them say eventually, I don't know what happened. I started out intending to do what was right, but then everything just fell apart. But why does that happen? Because they did not expose themselves to the truth. And for this same reason, throughout Judges, there's this repeated cycle of failure and defeat. And finally, at least for a while, there's deliverance by God. But then the cycle began all over again. In the midst of this story of failure and defeat, the final of chapters of Judges probably depict the most terrible and the darkest picture of depravity in the history of Israel. The situation is a result of this repeated cycle of moral failure. However, Right in the midst of all this shines the wonderful story of Ruth. I love the story of Ruth. In the book of Ruth, you have the picture of faithfulness in the midst of defeat. You have the story of a non-Israelite woman who's from Moab, which is modern-day Jordan. There's a terrible famine. She had just lost her husband. She was now about to lose her mother-in-law because mother-in-law had also lost her husband and her other son, and she was moving back to Israel. But this non-Israelite woman heard the voice of God calling her to go with Naomi. So what does Ruth do? She leaves everything. She leaves her friends. She leaves her family. She leaves her home. She leaves the gods of her ancestors, and she dedicates her life to her mother-in-law, Naomi, and returned with her to Israel. It is one of the more delightful stories in the whole Bible. After returning to Naomi's ancestral lands, this young widow meets a wealthy bachelor, and they were married, and he vowed to care not only for her, but also for her mother-in-law. It is a story that tears at your heartstrings as you read it. When Ruth left her home and all her friends, she manifested a willingness to walk with God despite all the defeat and failure in the land around her. Listen to what Ruth, who, remember, is a polytheist, who doesn't believe in the God that is talking to her in the beginning of this book. Listen to what she says to Naomi, and it is truly a beautiful sentiment. Ruth 1:16. Please don't tell me to leave you and return home. I will go where you go. I will live where you live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I will die where you die and be buried beside you. May the Lord punish me if we are ever separated. So, in the midst of God's people's faithlessness that we see in Judges, you have the story of an outsider displaying incredible godly attitudes. The Israelites were stuck in this cycle of defeat because of their lack of faith, while an outsider was deeply blessed because of her faith. Faith in difficult situations is essential to being a child of God. And as the age of Judges is coming to an end, we come to the last judge, Samuel. Judges depicts the danger of delusion. Well, first Samuel expresses the danger of being a people pleaser. This is largely the story of two men, Samuel and Saul. In the latter part of the book, David's early history is interwoven into King Saul's, but we'll look at that more next week. First Samuel begins with the faith of a mother who is constantly ridiculed by her husband's other wives because she couldn't get pregnant. So she's in this polygamous relationship. The other women that her husband's married to are teasing her and ridiculing her and making her feel just like lesser of a human being because she can't have a baby. So in tears, she goes to the temple. She pours her heart out to God and promises to dedicate her son to the Lord's service if she is blessed with the gift of a child. And we're then told that God hears her prayers, blesses her, and she gives birth to Samuel. Samuel grew to be a wonderful person, a servant of God. His entire life was dedicated to serving the Lord and all of God's people. And he did that in three primary ways. Samuel was the last and, in my opinion, the greatest judge that Israel ever had. He was also a high priest, and he was a prophet. His ministry lasted for 40 years, and that's a conservative number. But Samuel was growing older. The people grew more and more distant from God. And because of this, the people were hungering after something other than God. But this great danger of faith is highlighted in 1 Samuel 8, verse 5. One day, the people of Israel came to Samuel and said this, "You are an old man." Great way to start a conversation, right? But you are an old man. You set a good example for your sons, but they haven't followed it. Now we want a king to be our leader, just like the other nations. Choose one for us. Now, on the surface, if you're just reading this on the surface level, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But the trouble with this request was that Samuel wasn't the leader of Israel. God was intended to be the leader of Israel. God had called this nation to be unlike all other nations because God, not some human being, was supposed to be their king. But here, they were hungering to be like the other nations who had a living, breathing, human king they could hold up and honor. Specifically, they were hungry to have some kind of authority other than Yahweh. That's a big danger. They desired the rule of man over the rule of God. If God, in God, they had been given incredible freedom. And the same is true for us. In Jesus, we have been given freedom beyond all understanding. But many people find that freedom that they are given is difficult to handle. I mean, just think about that for a moment. In Christ, we have been given freedom, but in that freedom, we must continually exercise judgment, not of other people, but judgment about situations, make decisions, and evaluate circumstances. But there are a lot of people who just don't want to do that. They don't like the freedom God gives us in Christ. What many people, even though they would never admit this, nobody would ever admit that they want this, but I have had Bible studies where I talked about freedom, and at some point, the person I'm talking to will say, just give me a simple rule to follow instead of all these principles. That's all I want. If I just had a straightforward rule, then I would follow it, and that would be good enough for God. But a life lived under rules is always a life lived in bondage. And that's not the kind of life that God wants for us. So Israel, though, during Samuel's time, they wanted a human ruler. And as a result, God allowed the people to choose a king. So they chose Saul. And Saul looked like a king. We're told he was tall, he was handsome, he stood out in the crowd. However, the story of Saul is one of the great tragedies in the Bible. He was a man of great promise, but the story of his life is the danger of seeking the favor of people over God. Now, for a while, he did okay as a king, but the defeat of Saul came about as a result of his campaign against the Amalekites. Samuel, as a prophet, had delivered a message to King Saul telling him what God wanted him to do. And after considering military strategies, he led Israel's army into battle. Now, the command Saul was given was to wipe the entire people out. All of the Amalekites were supposed to be wiped out. So Saul didn't do that. Saul chose to let the king, Agag, live. He captured their king alive so that the Israelites and then all the kings of other nations might be terrified by his abilities. He intended to show his power. He intended to establish his supremacy in the land. But why did he go against God's will to do that? Because he felt this would find him favor in the eyes of the people. So the awful tragedy of Saul's life was the danger of a divided allegiance. He was quite content to serve God as long as it pleased those around him. The failure in this man's life was that he had a continual hunger for the affection, honor, and favor of others rather than God. And maybe you discovered that in your own life. It is a problem that will ultimately defeat you and bring the same tragic end that Saul finally came to. His kingdom was taken away, his crown was removed, and he lost everything. But in the midst of all that, a light breaks through the story with a man named David. It was referred to as a person after God's own heart, a man who would break the cycle of defeat, at least for a while. But we'll talk about his story next week. It's a great story, and I look forward to sharing it with you. Let's end here for today. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you again real soon.